We're at the end of chapter 13, and we're going to speak about truth. Hopefully we'll be speaking the truth about truth. No, seriously speaking, we're going to speak about truth. And last week we spoke about relative truth, that it is possible for a person, specifically the Benoni, to be in a position where they are doing what they're supposed to do in terms of meditating and concentrating on their prayers, and they get into this very deep connection to Hashem, where it feels fiery and it feels powerful, and they have this tremendous love of Hashem, etc. And they temporarily experience what a tzaddik experiences 24/7. And the tzaddik looks at this person and says, "That's not real. How could it be real if, when you finish davening, it all dissolves, it all disappears?" And in the tzaddik's reality, whatever is, whatever the experience of connection to Hashem is, it's consistent, it's uninterrupted, it's absolutely reliable. So from the tzaddik's vantage point, the Benoni is, you think you're having an experience, but it's not a real experience. And then we said last week that may be true in the purest form, but at the same time, if you have a consistent and repeated experience, and especially if it's one that you can control, in other words, the Benoni, any day that he or she chooses, can decide to focus and to concentrate and to meditate on the prayer experience and to develop that connection to Hashem, and that can reawaken every single time that they choose to do so. So therefore that makes it a real experience. It's a real experience that you can replicate on a regular basis. But what they did for us, and what's going to take us from here to the end of the chapter, is it open up the conversation about what is real, what is true, what is emes. Last week we touched briefly on the idea that the actual word itself, emes, in Hebrew is made up of three letters: Aleph the first, Mem the middle, and Tov the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And what that's supposed to represent is this consistency, that it doesn't matter where you are on the spectrum, it doesn't matter what's going on in your world, it doesn't matter what the weather is, it doesn't matter what the political climate is, it doesn't matter what your mood is. MS is absolutely consistent. That is the symptom, that is the symbol of truth. But today we're going to unpack this a little bit further, and we're going to take that same concept, this consistency and this ability of MS, of truth, to stretch right through all kinds of different scenarios and to retain its truth. We're going to understand that from a deeper perspective, and we're specifically going to link MS to a particular part of our service of Hashem. So we've spoken about tremendous love of Hashem, and this fiery love that the tzaddik experiences all the time and that the Benoni experiences during prayer. But today we're actually going to identify another part of the emotional attachment that we have to Hashem, a different attribute, a different midah, and we're going to link that specifically to MS. And in doing so, we're also going to identify a personality, and this is quite useful for us. We're going to identify a personality in Jewish history, very important and central personality, who is the epitome of MS, of truth, and knowing a little bit more about them and about their life will also help us to appreciate what absolute truth is. So it's not, so to speak, the core message of this chapter. The core message of this chapter was that the Benoni is able, through their efforts, to activate an experience where they feel like a tzaddik, and yet at the same time the Benoni has to be conscious of the fact that in certain ways they are similar to a Rasha. In which way specifically? The fact that there are still temptations, etc. So that was really the main thrust of this chapter, but it's allowed us the opportunity to enter into this conversation about truth. And it's a fascinating conversation, because at the same time that we say that truth is absolutely consistent, at the exact same time we say the consistency of truth is, sounds a little bit ironic, its ability to manifest in different ways. So that sounds like a self-contradictory principle. How could you suggest that something is true, MS, which sounds like it's absolute and it's immutable and it's unchangeable, and yet we're going to say, but it could also manifest in various ways? So, by way of introduction, before we get into this, I'm going to make a statement, and I'd like you to tell me, is this statement true or false? You ready for this? Okay, here's the statement. The statement is that behind me there is a bookshelf. Is that true or false? Truth is, it's a little bit of an unfair question, because for those people who are in the shir, in the room, you have an advantage over the people online, because the people online could think this is green screen, and the people in the room can tell if it's real or not. So you'll have to just take my word for it that it's not green screen. So now my question is, this is a bookshelf. True or false? What do you say? Depends. True or false? Depends. That is a Jewish answer. We say depends. I'm not disagreeing with that. I'm just saying it's a Jewish answer. true. Okay, we have one vote in favor of true. We have one sitting on the fence saying it depends. True. Okay, good. Now, I'll tell you why this was an unfair question. See, what do I mean by true? If the definition of true, of MS, is something which is consistent at all times, under all circumstances, so if I were to dial the clock back 2 years ago and be sitting in exactly this position, there was not a bookshelf behind me. So historically, was that true? It's currently, it is true that this is a bookshelf. Historically, was it true that this was a bookshelf? And the answer to that would have to be no.
Could have been a bookshelf somewhere else.
What's that?
A bookshelf somewhere else.
Could have been a bookshelf somewhere else. It could be it just wasn't made yet. Right? It could be that we just hadn't yet had somebody build this bookshelf, right? Let's project ourselves 100 years into the future. Will this be a bookshelf? I don't know. I do not have a crystal ball. And the likelihood is that even if in 100 years' time this is a bookshelf, the likelihood is it will have had some of the shelves swapped out because they would have been worn down and they would have had to be replaced. And in all likelihood, the books that are on the shelf would be different books because these would have been well used and they'd have to be discarded and would have to get new ones. And even if they were not well used, the reality is we'd probably update the bookshelf with new Sepharim, we'd move things around because etc., etc., etc. Basically, what I'm trying to illustrate is that what is considered to be true is not true in all situations, in all circumstances. It's a nice surprise, right? So it's not true in all situations, all circumstances, even though right now it's true. So what I'm trying to illustrate is that this concept of truth, it really, and the correct answer is it depends, right? So that was a good answer, right? It really does depend. It depends on what I mean by true. Do I mean that it is physically true currently? Yes. Do I mean that it is eternally true? Not necessarily. Just because something is true now does not mean that it's true always. Conceptually, is it true? I don't know. Could be that conceptually, if I'm a surrealist artist, so I'm going to say, it's not true. It's an expression of the different, I don't know, whatever, you'll come up with something on that. The bottom line is that before we delve into this evening's conversation, we have to recognize the possibility that what we're saying is true could depend on the circumstances. That's what's fascinating and paradoxical about truth. That on the one hand, absolute truth is absolute, and on the other hand, there is the possibility of truth operating in multiple realities, and sometimes even simultaneously, although we're not really looking for simultaneous. We're looking at different circumstances. So with that in mind, a little bit of a mind bender. So with that in mind, let's have a look at the text, page 58, if you're looking in the Tanya. And we are looking, very good. In conclusion, only Hashem is the only absolute truth. Yes, that is true. If I'm talking about absolute truth, only Hashem is absolute truth. Which, by the way, throws a major spanner in the works of our whole lives. So what? Are we not real? Because only Hashem is real. Okay, big topic, much to discuss. So page 58 is about 8 lines from the bottom of the page if you are looking in the book. Otherwise, we'll put it up over here on the screen. And that is the last line on the screen, the third word. So regardless of whether you're looking on the screen or you're looking in the book, it's the third word. Ki. Hine, like I said to you in the beginning, we're going to associate MS, truth, the principle of truth. We're going to associate with a very important personality in Torah, in our history. And that's going to help us associate it with a particular emotional trait, particular midah. And that will obviously give us a good understanding of what MS really is. So, ki hine midas MS. Now, the trait of MS, he midasoi shel Yaakov. That is the trait that is associated with our forefather Yaakov. Okay, now let's talk about that for a moment. We're obviously making a comparison over here. If we're referring to Yaakov, we're comparing Yaakov to his father and his grandfather, to Yitzchak and to Abraham. Now, that's a little bit of a strange thought. How are we suggesting that Yaakov is the one who is the attribute of truth, and that sounds almost like it's to the exclusion of Yitzchak and Abraham. So what are we saying? Were they not authentic? Were they not genuine? Were they not real? What do we mean when we say that Yaakov is the epitome of truth? In other words, when Abraham, for example, gets up, packs up his whole family, his whole life at 75 years old, and heads to the promised land, which, by the way, is undisclosed at that point when Hashem says to him, Lech lecha, leave everything behind. When he goes at that point, is that emes? Is that true dedication to Hashem? Yes or no? Of course it is. It's incredible dedication to Hashem. It's absolutely authentic. It's absolutely true. It's absolutely consistent. It's absolutely reliable. So how then can we say that Abraham is not the epitome of truth? Or, in this week's parasha, when Hashem tells Abraham, I want you to take your son, the son who you love, the son who is unique to you, Yitzchak, and take him up a mountain, va'aleu la'oila, and you should bring him as an offering to me. And Abraham, not only does he do it, but he jumps out of bed in the morning, by Yashkem Avraham Baboiker, he jumps out of bed in the morning, he saddles his own donkey, which Rashi points out is incredibly unusual for a man of his stature. He's got other people to do that. He's got, workers who could have saddled his donkey for him. But why is he doing it? Because he's absolutely dedicated and enthusiastic to do what Hashem wants. Is that authentic? Is that genuine? Or is it all for show? Because maybe Abraham knew that one day that's going to be a big chapter in the Torah and everybody's going to talk about it, and he was looking for accolades. So was it true? Was his dedication to Hashem true? Yes or no? Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Of course it was true. It was absolute. It was genuine. It was authentic at the deepest level of authenticity. How about Yitzchak? When Yitzchak goes along with his father, bearing in mind that unlike the way that it's depicted in the biblical cartoons, Yitzchak at this point is 37 years old. He is a conscious adult who can make his own decisions, and as soon as he realizes that his father's marching him up an isolated mountainside with a knife and some wood and no animal in sight, he realizes what's going on, and Yitzchak still goes ahead and he participates in the plan. Was that authentic? Was he genuinely ready to die for God at that point in time? Absolutely. So what do we mean that Midas Emes is Midas Yaakov, that the attribute of truth is the trait of Yaakov? Why Yaakov more than anybody else? When Moshe comes down from Mount Sinai and says, here is the Torah, is that not absolute truth, etc.? Okay, so what is it about Yaakov that we can use to identify that Yaakov is the symbol of truth? Let's think. What about Yaakov's life distinguishes him first and foremost from his father and his grandfather? And then generally speaking, what distinguishes Yaakov from the behavior of various other very great people through the course of history? Let's try and unpack it. So firstly, what is the distinction or distinctions that you could make between Yaakov and his story on the one hand, and Abraham and Yitzchak and their stories on the other hand? Let's start there. So what would you say are the glaring differences?
A lot of Yaakov's life wasn't in Israel.
Good. So a lot of Yaakov's life was not in Israel. That's a very interesting point. Although you could argue that a lot of Avraham's life was also not in Israel, because remember, only at the age of 75 does he go to Israel in the first place. So I'm not disagreeing, just because it is a big point that a lot of Yaakov's life is outside of Israel, but I think we need to be a little bit more specific. So Avraham also spent a lot of time outside of Israel. What is unique about Yaakov compared to Avraham in that regard? Okay, Gary says he is a tam. What does tam mean? It's a very important word because the Torah tells us Yaakov ish tam. Yaakov was a person who was tam. Yoshev Oyhalim, who sat in the tents, which the sages explain are the tents of Shem and Aver, where you could actually study about God and about whatever Torah was available at that particular point in time. But what does tam mean?
I think he was complete.
Complete. The word tam comes from the word tamim, which means complete. Okay, which would associate with the idea of emes, because emes is complete. There are no missing pieces. There are no hitches or bumps along the way. It's complete. It's consolidated. It's consistent. So that would be an association. The other meaning of the word tam is sincere. And if a person obviously is a person of truth, then they must be a person of sincerity. So we would see that link as well. What about Yitzchak and Abraham is fundamentally different to Yaakov? And I'm not disagreeing that Yaakov spent a lot of time outside of Israel. It's a relevant point, and we will speak about it, but we're not there yet. Just fundamentally, what's the difference? Okay, I'll give you a clue. What is the difference between the legacy that Abraham and Yitzchak leave behind versus the legacy that Yaakov leaves behind? And this is a very important clue.
His children.
Their children. Their children. Avraham only has one child who stays the course. Because remember, Avraham has Ishmael, and then later, as we'll see in next week's parasha, he has even more children. All children that don't get any airtime in the Jewish religion, right? But they're there, they exist. So out of all of Abraham's children, one of them is true to his system, to his beliefs, to his ideology. What about Yitzchak? The same, right? One of his children. Okay, in Yitzchak's case, there are only two children. There's Yaakov and Esav. But the fact is, only one of them stays the course. And Yishmael, in Abraham's case, goes off to become Pere Adam, a wild man who spawns a whole legacy of individuals who are misaligned with what Hashem wants. And Esav becomes Ish Yodei Tzayid Ish Tzadeh, becomes a man of the field, a hunter, a murderer, a philanderer, an idolater, whatever you want, and also spawns a whole legacy of people who are incredibly aggressive and go about waging wars with everybody on the planet. So who lands up with all of his children aligned with his value system? Only Yaakov. What does that tell you? That is emes. That is truth. In other words, if my value system is only true for me and some of the people in my family, that means that there is some level of emes lacking in that value system. Whereas if my value system is absolute and all the family participates, all my children, as the expression goes, it says Yaakov mitosoi shalema, which means basically all of his children are aligned, that indicates that his value system is impeccable, that it has absolute integrity. Now you've got to be really careful how you say this, because God forbid should we in any way insinuate that Abraham or Yitzchak were not serving Hashem with genuine, authentic commitment. So what do we mean when we say that they were not midas emes? So here's where we get into where it becomes a little bit more subtle and a lot more insightful. Avraham is the epitome of chesed. What is chesed? Kindness. What else is chesed? Because everybody defaults to kindness, okay? What else is chesed besides kindness? Hospitality, which falls under the brand of kindness. What else is it besides kindness? Who's the most chesed person you know? Think about them and think about their traits. What else is it besides kindness? They what? They think of others. So that's kindness. No, let's flesh it out. The what? What? We're losing you, Gary. Say that again. Love, which is very much associated with kindness. What else? Right, so we're going to leave out mercy, and we're going to leave out empathy, because those are not chesed traits. I know they sound like chesed traits. You'd imagine that they're chesed traits, but they're actually not. So mercy, compassion, empathy are not chesed. Chesed is sympathy, very different from empathy. So what is chesed? So the missing link over here is chesed is also tolerance. If I have tolerance, that means you do not have to be living emes to be okay in my books, because I can tolerate an alternative. And if I tolerate an alternative, then potentially I allow the possibility of that alternative spiraling out of control. So if I'm a real chesed person, like Abraham was, with tremendous love and tremendous kindness and tremendous tolerance, then when there's a wild man in the family called Yishmael, and I don't insist that he has to rein himself in, then I've allowed the crack through which something other than MS could manifest. Or to put it a little differently, chesed is obviously a really healthy and a very good thing. I mean, everybody wants to be able to say, I'm kind, I'm loving, I'm generous, I'm benevolent, I'm tolerant. Everybody wants to have those accolades. You know the story of the rabbi and the priest are busy discussing what they'd like people to say about them at their funeral. So the priest says, I'd like everybody to say he was very kind, he was very tolerant, he was very generous, he cared about the underdog, he always had an open door policy. Like, that's what I want them to say at my funeral. The rabbi says, you know what I want them to say at my funeral? I want them to say, oh my gosh, he's moving. So chesed, kindness, is all about what we do for who? Who is chesed for? Ourselves. I'm a kind person. Therefore, because I'm a kind person, I'm going to be kind to you. It might not be the best thing for you. Maybe what you need in your life right now is some discipline. But I'm a good person. I'm a tolerant person. I'm a compassionate person. I'm Western Europe. We accept everybody. We don't judge. We don't label. That's who I am. Right? And maybe that's not what you need. And maybe it's not going to align you with what is best for you. Therefore, in the extreme version of chesed, you could lose the possibility of incubating emes, absolute truth. Why? Because you are too caught up in your kindness and tolerance that you don't correct when the correction is needed. So for a Yishmael character operating in an environment that is so free and loving and giving, he becomes a spoiled brat with all of the fallout that follows that. Yitzchak is the exact opposite end of the spectrum. Yitzchak is an extremist of Gevura. What's Gevura? Strength. What else is Gevura? What's the ultimate strength? What? Discipline. The ultimate Gevura is discipline. In other words, Gevura is not force. When we talk about strength, strength is the ability to focus. Strength is the ability to contain. Strength is the ability to limit ourselves, to know when not to speak, when not to intervene. And Gevura also tends to have high expectations. Gevura means I have a harshness to me. So I want things to be at a certain level and I want things to be done in a particular way in order for them to be acceptable. So when you grow up in a family where everything is Gevura and you celebrate the value of that focus and the value of that self-discipline and that value of high standards, and you happen to be somebody who is an aggressive person, and you've never really been inculcated with the value of some softness and kindness and tolerance, then you turn into an Esav. Yitzchak's Gevura, like Abraham's Chesed, is absolutely pristine and holy and focused and connected. It's just the people in their orbit who abuse that extreme version of serving Hashem. So Yishmael abuses the freedom to become a brat, and Esav abuses the concept of harsh and high standards and focus and discipline to become a military person and an aggressor and eventually a murderer. Yaakov is the person who is not an extremist on either side, and as we'll see in a moment, he is what we call the Midas Harachamim or Midas Hachet. Actually, we're not going to say it in the words over here, but he's Midas Harachamim. He's the enemy. He is compassion. He is empathy. He is mercy. Because what mercy and compassion mean is that I understand where you are rather than just impose my reality onto you. If you want to achieve MS, it can't just be about your own MS. It's got to be about the MS. In other words, what does the individual need in order to get them to their ultimate, not just what works for me and therefore should work for you. So again, Abraham and Yitzchak are ideal in their service of Hashem. They are perfect, but it's not perfect for the environment. Whereas Yaakov models an approach that works within the environment, kind of sees, and you can read this when you look at all the names that Yaakov gives to his children, and then subsequently the blessings that he gives to his children later in life. You can see how he is relating to each of them individually. So that's what we call Tiferes, that's what we call Rachamim. That is the middle path. So Avraham is the extreme right, which is chesed. Yitzchak is the extreme left, which is gevura. It is Yaakov who sits there in the middle, balancing the two and harmonizing them into a new approach called Tiferes. That's where MS lies. And that is an incredible insight for us into what MS means. MS, truth, does not mean my way or the highway. That's what everybody thinks. Everybody thinks, I am the arbiter of truth. I am the custodian of truth. And if you are doing things differently to me, you got a problem. That's what we call religious extremism. Or political extremism. That's when a person says that I am here and I have a perspective and you are going to have to conform. So what is the role of Yaakov of Midas HaEmes? Hanikra, that is called Beriach HaTichon, the central beam, Hamavriach min HaKotze el HaKotze, which is able to pierce from one end, one extreme, to the other end, the other extreme. Okay? What does that mean? So if you go back to the construction of the Mishkan, the tabernacle, the sanctuary that we had in the desert, so do you remember how it was made? Do you remember how it was made? What's the main material that the Mishkan was made out of? Was wood, shittim wood. It's a particular kind of wood. So it was made out of wood. And what they did is they made boards, which then formed the walls of the structure of the Mishkan. And that what held those boards together was berichim, which are these poles or these bolts. And you ran them through different loops, like there were these rings on the outside of the Mishkan walls, and you put the bolts in to the rings, and that held everything together. So there were 3 levels of these brichim, 3 levels of these bolts, and the middle level was not an external bolt; it was actually put through the middle of the boards. So the external bolts only linked a few boards together at a time, whereas the internal bolt went from one edge of the wall to the other edge of the wall. That's what we're calling over here. Mavriach min hakotze el hakotze. It's that which, so to speak, pierced or extended from the one extreme to the other extreme. Now that's a description of the middle, the central beam, which is in a sense what held the whole Mishkan together. And it's metaphoric of the central beam of all of existence and the central beam of all character and the central beam of our relationship with Hashem, which is MS. Because in terms of MS, so in the Mishkan we're talking from one side to the other side. But in terms of MS we're saying that it means Meirum Hamaylos and Madregois, that this is something that extends from the very, very highest level in the very, very highest stage, ad soif kol dargin, till the very, very lowest stage, or the lowest step. I just want to draw your attention for 1 second to the fact that there's a switch of language over here. When we talk about the highest level, we say madregois, which is a Hebrew word. And when we speak about the lowest level, we say dargin, which is the same word in Aramaic. And that implies that the highest level is completely enveloped in holiness, and the lowest level is already engaged in the materialism of this world. That's why it's represented by a foreign language that's not a holy language. So what's interesting about MS is we've just discovered something fascinating. That MS, remember, we said MS is Aleph Mem Tov. It's from the beginning to the middle to the end. And in our minds, we thought that was just simply a consistency in time. So if I have the same values today that I had 10 years ago and that I will have in 10 years from now, then you know that those are my real authentic values because they've stood the test of time. That's how most of us understand what it means for something to be MS from beginning to middle to end. We've just introduced a whole different perspective, which is that something is MS at every level of existence. It's a fascinating thought, and it seems to be paradoxical because every level of existence is obviously different. And if it's different, how could that be MS? Let's put it a little differently. What if you had to teach a principle to somebody? What's the principle that you're going to teach today? What value would you like to teach people today?
Respect.
How's about truth? Honesty, yes? So we're going to teach the principle of honesty to people. Now, it depends who we're speaking to. That will determine how we teach this principle. So if we're speaking to people who are philosophers, we'll approach the value of honesty from a philosophical perspective. And if we're speaking to lawmakers, we'll speak about the value of honesty in order to be able to keep a society honest and functional. And if we're speaking to politicians, we might say, you have no idea what we're talking about on this topic. And if you are speaking to children, then you'd have to say very simply, never tell a lie. And maybe you'll tell them the story of George Washington and the cherry tree or whatever the case is, which apparently is not even a true story, so that's ironic in its own right. But anyhow, leave that for another time. So my point is, no matter which level you are addressing, and each of those levels is different, your message is consistent. The message is there's a value in honesty. And it's really important that we respect that value, and it's really important that we are not dishonest. So how you're telling it to a philosopher and the guise of that presentation is altogether different to how you're speaking to a business ethics crowd, which is completely different to how you're speaking to lawmakers, which is completely different to how you're speaking to children. Doesn't change the MS of what you're conveying. Just because the wrapping is different, because the presentation is different, does not in any way diminish the truth of the message. That's what we mean, mavriach min hakotze el hakotze, something that will ring true, that will be absolute in all situations and all circumstances, from top to bottom. That is MS. We're going to take it a step further than that. How do we take it a step further? Uvachol mailo umadrega, as the MS goes through this process of being shared either at the highest of heights or all the way down to the lowest and most, so to speak, materialistic parts, mavriach toich nekuda ha'emtsois, it will always touch the central beam, shehi nekudas ubchinas midas emes shelo, which is the truth within every reality. This is really, really interesting stuff. So as this MS goes through all the various stages and levels, it will touch on and resonate with the core truth at every level. So let's understand that. Go back to the example. We're trying to convey the value of honesty to various audiences, and those various audiences are different ages and maturities and different types of intellects and different types of focus. So we sit down in front of the group of philosophers and we use philosophical argument to illustrate why honesty is so important. So what have we done for them? To these people who live in the world of philosophy, we have addressed philosophically why honesty is so important, why authenticity is so important. You know what we've also done? We've alerted them to the importance in philosophy of keeping it real, keeping it authentic. In other words, we haven't just told them philosophically there's a principle called MS, called honesty, called integrity, called authenticity, which is valuable in the generic sense. Of course, that's part of what we've done. But simultaneously, what we've also done is we have touched the core of philosophy. At which point is philosophy valid? When it sticks to honest principles. If your philosophy is like the old story of the guy who shoots the arrow and then paints the target, in other words, if your philosophy is, I'd like this to be the conclusion and therefore I'm going to develop a whole philosophy around it, that is not philosophy. That is rationalization, which is a completely different concept. So not only have I taught them generically that there's a value to honesty, but I've actually illustrated and highlighted the MS in your world of philosophy. In your world, there's a value to honesty. In your world, philosophy is useless if it doesn't stick to honest principles. And by the same token, when I sit with a group of people learning about business ethics, not only am I going to say to them that the value of running a business with ethics is that you will be a decent human being and that will be aligned with what Hashem wants, and it's a higher level value, which is all true. But I'm essentially going to illustrate to the person that if business lacks ethics, if business lacks integrity, then the business is not real business. It's borderline crime. It's not business. It's the MS. What you're learning is the truth of what business is integrity. The ideal of business is not to take advantage of other people or cut corners or cheat the taxman. The value of business is integrity. And that's essentially what we're saying over here, that this principle of mavriach min hakotze el hakotze, that truth is something which pierces from the highest to the lowest level. It's not only that the values and principles are true in all scenarios, but they help to bring out the truth in every scenario. Now, why is that relevant to us? Because we have a Beinoni who has these occasional experiences of feeling connected in the deepest way, like the tzaddik does. And the tzaddik could say, I don't know if that's real. I don't know if that's authentic, because it dissolves as soon as you close the siddur. And my relationship with Hashem is absolutely consistent. So my relationship with Hashem feels like emes, but the Beinoni feels like maybe it's not so emes. Well, that's exactly the point. The power and paradoxical reality of truth is that it can find the core truth even in something that is not living emes all the time. Now, if that sounds a little bit difficult to digest, let's put it into these terms. Let's say that somebody knocks on your door and says, listen, I'm going through a really difficult financial time. Can you help me? And you decide that you're going to help them. Why? Not because there's a mitzvah to give tzedakah. But the reason you're going to help them is because earlier in the week, you had a conversation with a friend of yours about whether people today have become selfish or generous. And your argument was that people are still generous despite all the social media and the self-interest and the sense of entitlement. So your argument was humans are still generous. And so now that this guy is knocking on your door, you don't actually have an option anymore. The reason that you've got to give him money is because you have to vindicate yourself so that the next time you see your friend, you can say, by the way, I proved my point yesterday, that a stranger came to my house and I still gave him money. So is that a genuine or an insincere motivation? What do you say? It's an insincere motivation. I'm not doing this because it's a mitzvah. I'm not doing it because it's the right thing to do. I'm doing it so I can have one-upmanship on my friend the next time I see him. Right? Or, here's another motivation. I just happened to go to a shir this morning that said, if you give tzedakah, Hashem will repay you tenfold. Voila, there's my opportunity. Guy knocking on my door. This is a great investment. I'm going to give him tzedakah, and then I'm going to sit there checking my bank account for the next week to see where's the 10 times that Hashem's giving me. Is that a genuine or insincere motivation? Insincere. But you know what the Gemara has to say about that kind of motivation? It says that a person should always engage in Torah study and the performance of mitzvahs, even if they have insincere intentions, because out of habituating ourselves to do the right things, albeit for the wrong reasons, we'll eventually come to do the right things for the right reasons. Comes along Hasidus and says, that line is more profound than you think. Mitoich, from within the loy lishma, that which appears to be an insincere intention, within that, deep down at its core, there is a sincere intention. Because as the Rambam writes, the nature of all of us is to do what Hashem expects of us. It's just that we get caught up in all kinds of nonsense that distracts us. But really what we want to do is everything that Hashem expects of us. So what is our core motivation? To do what's correct, because that's what Hashem wants. So what is our emes? What is our truth? Our truth is not, I'm giving tzedakah so I'll get more money, even though we're conscious of that. Our truth is, I'm not giving tzedakah because I because I had a debate with somebody else and now it's going to prove my point. My truth is, I'm giving tzedakah because that's what my neshama wants to do, because it's aligned with Hashem. So that's what we're saying over here, that the midas emes, the nature and the attribute of truth, touches on and illuminates the truth in every scenario. It illuminates that when that Beinoni is spending an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, whatever it is, on focused prayer, and in that experience is having a deep, meaningful connection to Hashem, that is true. Because it's the rest of the day that the Beinoni is operating at a less core level. But it's this part of the day when you see the truth of who that person is. And therefore we say, it's for that reason that we say that the attribute of truth is an inheritance without any limitations. It's alluded to in the blessing that Hashem gave to Yaakov, where he told him, "Uforatzta," that you will expand or you will burst forth, Yamav, Kedmav, Tzafoinav, Negba, in all of the directions. That implies that nothing can hold you back, nothing can limit you. That is the power of MS. If something is true, it cannot be limited by superficiality. It cannot be limited by the fact that maybe I'm not tuned in. It cannot be limited because I have a weakness. Therefore, truth should not be truth. No, the truth is absolute. And there is no limit to how high that aspect of truth could take a person. So again, you could have a Beinoni who's having a temporary experience of connection to Hashem at the deepest level, and yet that elevates them to the highest levels because they're plugged in to the column that goes from top to bottom. In other words, I've now tuned into a reality that is bigger than the time and space of my current experience, which means in simple English, anytime I do something, which is MS, which means anytime I do something which is aligned with what Hashem wants, I am keying into a reality that's bigger than me, that is not stuck in my personal foibles, in my personal limitations. And not only that, the other thing that you have to understand is when you've got the scale that goes from lowest to highest or from highest to lowest, you have to acknowledge that there's also the idea that as you progress up that scale, each transition you make totally reframes what truth and reality is. And that's something we can all relate to. Because all of us go through a journey and we all mature and we all develop and we all grow. And in that journey, we think we've made it at some point. And we think, oh, now I know what it's all about. Now I understand that this is my authentic feeling. It reminds me a little bit of a person that I know who used to tell young couples when they just got married that you cannot know what love is until you've been married for 7 years. And the young couples used to go crazy when they heard that. What do you mean? We're so in love. It's so amazing. Well, that's exactly how it is. Because in the early stages of love, you think this is true love, and you write poems about it, and you send letters to each other, and you do all these things. But then, as a couple matures in their relationship, they realize, oh, what we thought was love, that's not love. Now there's something far deeper, far more profound. This is love. And then you progress further and you say, oh, what we thought. Can you imagine? We thought that was mature love. And now we know what love is. That's the nature of truth. You discover deeper and deeper and deeper perspectives of truth. And as you do, what previously you thought was truth fades away. So for the Beinoni, the truth of their relationship with Hashem, which is genuine and authentic, is, right now I'm connected to Hashem through the prayer and the experience of that focus and the love that it generates. But the tzaddik is so much higher up the developmental chain that the tzaddik looks like that and says, you think that's truth. You think you know what MS is. For you, it's genuine. For you, it's real. For you, it's life-changing. But compared to what there is out there, as you climb, as you ascend through this column of Bria Chatichon, of the central beam of truth, there is still so much more that you could experience. And when you do, that's when what you used to believe was authentic experience of godliness will pale in comparison to what you can now access. And then he puts just in parentheses at the end of the chapter, the Kabbalists teach us that when you're at the highest state of a low level, then you are lower than the lowest state of the higher level. Which is very simple, because effectively what that means is when a person, the easiest way to understand this is, when a person graduates high school with a full house, and they're the top of the pops, and they're the most successful academic in the school, and then they go to university, they very quickly realize that what was top of the pops in high school is literally the bottom of the barrel in university. Because it's a whole different reality and it's a whole different world, and suddenly you don't even compare. And it's the same thing spiritually. So what's the highest level for a Beinoni is lower than the lowest experience of a tzaddik. For the Beinoni, it's absolute, it's meaningful, it's authentic, it's spiritual, it's inspiring, all of the things that you wish for the experience to be. But compared to a tzaddik, it's like you haven't even graduated. And that is alluded to in a saying of our sages, where they describe the nature of the spiritual multiverse, where they speak about the fact that the distance from earth to heaven is a distance that would take 500 years of travel. And then from one layer of heaven to the next layer of heaven is 500 years of travel. And that's all in the physical universe. So in other words, even when we talk about heaven over there, we're talking about very lowly levels. And then eventually you get to these angels called chayos, the feet of those chayos is more sophisticated, more complex, more spiritually developed than all of those worlds that for us would take thousands of years of development and progress to go through. What's in our world, this incredible growth, in the angels' world, you haven't even got out of the starting blocks. And that's the message to us, and it's, I think, a very powerful message, is that MS, absolute truth, is something that will be consistent right through all experiences and all levels. And therefore, as long as a person is seeking the truth at the level that they're at, they can plug into something far greater than themselves. But at the same time, we have to realize that for those who are at a lower level, what is considered their peak doesn't even touch the surface of what is the beginning of the next level. So a Benoni to a Tzaddik is worlds apart. And with that, we actually conclude chapter 13, which is a nice achievement. And please God, we can then move on to chapter 14 in our next class.